Hello, everyone. Welcome to New Polity's podcast. You are about to listen to Matthew Crawford, best-selling author of books like Shop Class's Soulcraft and Why We Drive. He's going to be speaking on technocracy and the vital force in man. He gave this talk at our last conference, and if you haven't gotten tickets to this conference, 2025, do it. I know that often for listeners of our podcast, you can feel kind of alone intellectually out there, thinking about the sin of liberalism, of the usurious economy, or of the limits of the secular, and a genuine desire for a new Christian polity. Well, you're not alone. Actually, there's hundreds of people like you, at least hundreds, and they're all coming to New Polity's conference. And we make sure to have plenty of time for getting in touch with each other, for eating meals together, for praying together, for singing together, and to listening to some really great speakers. So if you haven't gotten tickets to our conference yet, please go to newpolity.com/events. Thanks.
Well, thanks for the really excessively warm welcome, Jacob. It's an honor to be here, genuinely. It seems like you all have embarked on an experiment here in renewal. Is that too close? Okay. So it's just, I've been here less than 24 hours, but it's pretty exciting. So first, there's should we destroy the server? Well, of course, yes. You have to have a whole conference to decide this. You could even say it's your duty as domestic extremists. Or at least you all seem extremely domestic. I don't think I've ever seen so many babies, but I guess you all must be Catholics or something. So I want to start with a quote from Tocqueville you've probably seen before because it's just so apt. He says, "The despotism that I fear for the generations to come has no precedent in the world and lacks a name." So he's writing around 1835. "It does not break wills, but it softens them, bends them and directs them. It rarely forces action, but it constantly opposes your acting. It does not destroy, it prevents birth. It does not tyrannize, it hinders. It represses, it enervates, it extinguishes. It stupefies, and finally it reduces each nation to being nothing more than a flock of timid and industrious animals, of which the government is the shepherd." So you have to have a caveat, I think. So what he's calling the government, I think, is no longer this thing that's just in Washington, D.C. It's distributed and devolved, and it's kind of hard to bring into focus. I'm reminded of Hannah Arendt refers to the rule of nobody. There's nobody that you can grab hold by the collar and demand an account of. It's some entity that can't be addressed. And to some extent, this lives in the servers. So let's talk about this, and to quote Tocqueville again, this power that is absolute, minute, regular, provident, and mild. It would be like the authority of a parent if, like that authority, its object was to prepare men for manhood, but it seeks, on the contrary, to keep them in perpetual childhood. So that's Tocqueville. A few years ago, one of Google's self-driving cars came to an intersection with a four-way stop. And so it came to a complete stop and waited for other cars to do the same before proceeding, because that's the rule it was taught. But of course, that's not what people do. So the robot car got completely paralyzed and blocked the intersection, and he had to be towed out of there. Probably some guy in a, grubby old tow truck had to come. And I like the image of that. Or it had to be rebooted, who knows. Now, tellingly, the Google engineer who was in charge of this project said that what he had learned from this episode is that, quote, human beings need to be less idiotic. So let's think about that. If there's an ambiguous case of right-of-way, human drivers will often make eye contact. Maybe one waves the other through, or indicates by the movements of the car itself a readiness to yield or not. It's not a stretch to say that there's a kind of body language of driving and a range of driving dispositions. We are endowed with social intelligence, through the exercise of which people work things out amongst themselves and usually manage to cooperate well enough. Tocqueville thought it was in small-bore practical activities demanding improvisation and cooperation that the habits of collective self-government were formed. And this is significant. There's something that can aptly be called the democratic personality, and it's cultivated not in the civics class, but in the granular features of everyday life. But the social intelligence on display at that intersection was completely invisible to the Google guy. And this, too, is significant. The premise behind the push for driverless cars is that human beings are terrible drivers. This is one instance of a wider pattern. There's a tacit picture of the human being that guides our institutions and provides a shared intellectual DNA for the governing classes. It has various elements, but the common thread is a low regard for human beings. If this mic could be a little less hot, take down just a little bit, it might be good. Yeah, thanks. So now maybe the Google guy was a classic software type, a little bit on the spectrum, who has a hard time perceiving social phenomena, such as the way an intersection actually works. But he needn't have been. He need only have been steeped in the prevailing account of how the human mind works, which is called the computational theory of mind. Mentation as computation continues to provide the intellectual foundation for the mainstream of cognitive science, despite coming in for devastating critique from the more phenomenologically oriented dissidents within that discipline, who emphasize the embodied nature of human intelligence and the fact that it's socially bootstrapped. But as a zombie metaphor that can't be killed, mind as computer anchors the popular superstition and marketing hype according to which machines are said to have artificial intelligence. Really a term of mystification that carries a tacit assertion that what a binary computer does is something very like human intelligence. And reciprocally, what the human mind does, not very well, unsurprisingly, is compute. Bad philosophy of mind tends to be the most well-capitalized because most easily operationalized, and one should not underestimate the genius of capital, no less than the state, for remaking the world so it will better fit some simplistic model, and thereby make the model more true. As the Google guy said, human beings need to become less idiotic. That is, more like computers. That is, more legible to systems of control and better adapted to the system's need for clean inputs. Gunther Anders, he's mostly known only for being the first husband of Hannah Arendt, but he was actually quite interesting in his own right. He spoke of the rising cost of fitting man to the service of his tools. Iris Murdoch, who I commend to you, she's I've never read her fiction actually, but she has these fantastic philosophical essays. She said that man is the animal who makes pictures of himself and then comes to resemble the pictures. So here's the real mischief done by conceiving human intelligence in the image of the computer. It carries an impoverished idea of what thinking is, but it's one that can be made adequate enough if only we can change the world to reduce the scope for the exercise of our full intelligence as embodied agents who do things. The modern view of man is consistent with the modern view of nature. Nature is raw material that can be reshaped at will. This is the technological attitude, which posits that there's no mystery in nature that can escape our comprehension, and therefore everything lies open to manipulation. Man himself is a natural object without any essence or purpose that must be respected. So the contents of his heart and mind are likewise open to scientific management. C.S. Lewis writes, "The power of man to make himself what he pleases," which is kind of offered in this liberatory spirit, right? We're liberated from nature and authority and from tradition. You can make yourself what you please. He says that what that really turns out to be is the power of some men to make other men what they please. So, technology. The word itself is interesting. So, combines two things: techne, which would mean skill in Greek, and logos, which here, let's say, that means intelligibility. And it seems to suggest these are somehow belong to the same moment. So, in his book Introduction to Christianity, Joseph Ratzinger kind of really explicates technology as a fundamental posture toward reality and truth. So what it comes down to is the idea that really we can only know what we make. So the cosmos isn't fully graspable. We can't penetrate to its innermost depths. And this seems to induce a kind of anxiety in modern man. So if you make something, you're the cause of it. And as the cause of it, you can know it sort of all the way down. So this kind of identifying knowing with making answers to the sort of anxious search for certainty that turns out to be quite important, and it's sort of a new thing. So Ratzinger refers to Giambattista Vico, who was an Italian philosopher writing around 1700, who was the first to formulate this new kind of mindset. And it's simply that we know only what we make. So, and then Ratzinger traces a couple of further sort of moments of inflection. Another decisive one comes with Marx, who's, well, first of all, sort of to know only what we make, that includes history, right? That's the record of man's doings. But then turns out, in the 19th century, well, actually, history is not that knowable. It requires a lot of interpretation. There's a lot of dispute. So along comes Marx, who says, what the task of philosophy is not to interpret the world, it's to change the world. So now knowing is identified with the makeable rather than the already made. So the feasible. So the task of thinking is a kind of activism. Okay. So Ratzinger traces a trajectory in which we turned in our basic orientation from the world made by God to what has been made by man to what it's feasible to do going forward. He then shows us that outside of this dynamic of the made and the makeable, there's available to us an entirely different orientation to reality, what he calls belief. So here's a quote from Ratzinger. When a man says credo, I believe, he's not primarily enunciating a program for changing the world or simply attaching himself to a chain of historical events. The act of believing does not belong to the relationship know-make, which is typical of the intellectual context of makeability thinking, but it's much better expressed in the quite different relationship stand-understand. So he elaborates this with a reflection on the word amen, and I'm going to get to that a little bit later. So here, belief is not an incomplete form of knowledge, the kind of thing that in principle could one day be verified or refuted. Instead, it's something you do in the present. It's a kind of loyalty. Ratzinger writes, belief operates on a completely different plane from that of making and makeability. Essentially, it is entrusting oneself to that which has not been made by oneself and never could be made, and which precisely in this way supports and makes possible all of our making. Meaning, that is, the ground on which our existence has a totality, on which our existence as a totality can stand and live, cannot be made but only received. So for Ratzinger, belief is not an act of the will, but it's a response to something received. And I want to really dwell on this idea of receiving now, as distinguished from making, because I think the basic orientation to the world that we call technology is one that deprives us of something that's sort of crucial to happiness, which is gratitude, gratitude for the given. So, gratitude. We feel gratitude when someone does something for us outside the realm of exchange. One wants to market this arrival of something that overflows what's expected and recognize the source of it. In acting outside necessity, our benefactor shines. Or one may feel gratitude without a counterparty to receive it, in response to some fortunate condition that could have been otherwise. Having good health or good looks, for example, life itself, something for which we're not responsible, a gift. Whether in response to good fortune or to some identifiable benefactor, in taking note of this gift, one feels that one has regained a proper coordinate system. It's a calm feeling. One shucks off that irritable, constant background sense of not receiving one's due, the sense of a self inflated beyond its true proportions. For it does feel like a little dose of truth, this moment of reorientation. Seeing oneself from the outside as one who receives rather than demands is also liberating from resentment, entitlement, grievance. You feel lighter as well as smaller, and more ready to act with grace toward others, that is, to be larger. For grace and gratitude have the same root, whether one's speaking etymologically or psychologically. Now, I think our condition as modern people makes the experience of gratitude especially elusive. So when we feel grateful, it has an effect that's all the more powerful, sort of bumping us out of a deep spiritual rut. And I think that's because the experience of gratitude is one that can't really be made sense of in a way that accords with the grand metaphysical picture that we live within, the one described by Ratzinger as sort of makeability thinking. If we can understand why this is so, It will give us a critical vantage point from which our historical moment, we can sort of put it in perspective. And it may also help to identify the source of our sourness and point the way towards something better. Most simply, gratitude requires that there be another, an outside world that is not under one's control and not of one's own making. Now, of course, it's simply the case that there is such a world, but there are different ways of responding to this fact. The English philosopher Michael Oakeshott wrote these two essays, which, if you put them side by side, offer a contrast between two personality types. One he calls the rationalist, and the other he calls the conservative. Now here, conservative doesn't refer to a political ideology. Instead, it names a disposition. What distinguishes the conservative is not hankering after the past, but rather affection for the present, for what actually exists. He has an eye for all the ways his surroundings afford a good life, or provide raw materials for the building of such a life. He wants to preserve the present world, not out of fearful, small-minded rejection of the possible, but because he has a greater awareness of the resources of the actual, which may be lost if we're not careful. In other words, he feels gratitude for the world and a sense of obligation to it. The rationalist, by contrast, looks at the world and is offended by the waste, the inefficiency, the chaos, the suffering, the grotesque failures of optimization, and wants to set it right. He has a vision of a better world, and that's where he lives, in devotion to his vision. Now, probably you need both types to have a healthy society. But in the present order, one of these types is full of confidence and speaks well into a microphone, while the other is apologetic and defensive. One has the wind of history at his back and is well capitalized. The other sometimes doubts his own sanity. Our own time has seen the emergence of a third type, the transhumanist, who's maybe just an over-the-top caricature of the rationalist. Like most caricatures, it brings into relief the defining features of the original through exaggeration. So here's a quote from a prominent transhumanist who was speaking to Paul Kingsnorth. I think it was a YouTube conversation. So the transhumanist says, I'd like to bring your attention to the issue with nature and biology that transhumanists have, that it's fundamentally flawed and likely even immoral to perpetuate, given its tendency to predation, disease, and death. Simply said, all nature and biology, from plants to wildlife to people, are something to be overcome and totally replaced with the synthetic. No one with even the slightest bit of compassion would ever create a world like ours, filled with so much suffering. It must all be undone and remade with technology, justice, and equality. So clearly, there's a theological point at issue here. It's not clear to me if this guy is saying there is a creator and he's a real bastard, or there's no creator and nature itself is a real bastard. In any case, the so-called created order is no order at all, but a filthy and cruel chaos. He says it would be immoral to perpetuate. So the transhumanist speaks as a moralist then. He appears to be animated by what Nietzsche called Ressentiment, which is the opposite of gratitude. In the Gnostic heresy, the world was created not by God, but by his evil twin, basically. It must be rejected and overcome through human effort. Doing so requires special knowledge, gnosis, which is to be cultivated in a priestly class. This finds its equivalent in today's technocratic managers and moral visionaries of equality, aflame with a vision of life beyond suffering that will arrive when the givens of life are totally replaced with the synthetic, as our transhumanists put it. The point is to bring about salvation here in this world, Vogelin's famous immanentizing the eschaton. As many have noted, the transsexual ideology is a version of transhumanism, pungently named by Mary Harrington as meat Lego Gnosticism. Because you put them together in so many different ways. From the beginning of the modern rationalist project, the body has been the thorn in the side of it. The creative freedom of the will is compromised by its entanglement with the body subject to natural necessities not of one's choosing. But if we reconceive the body as raw material, as meat Legos, and make man himself a technological project, then we can escape this subjugation to necessities that impinge from outside the will. But you don't have to look to the exotic fringe of transhumanism to see this. The whole movement of the present is to bring the world more fully under rational control. For example, substituting algorithms and mechanized certainties for the frailties of human judgment, as in the push for driverless cars and whatnot, or replacing the unclean clamor of democratic politics with expert administration. We may even take up this approach in relation to ourselves. For example, when we seek to eliminate the element of chance and serendipity in love through dating apps that optimize through personalized search criteria and cross-platform social media integration. That was a robot voice. I hope that was clear. This isn't quite the madness of Eros, the divine folly, a consuming flame one's cast into by the god despite oneself, to be magnificently destroyed at the feet of one's beloved, giving thanks all the while from a heart that is glad. Compared to that, life on the dating apps looks like a half-life of prudish solipsism, however many orgasms it may yield. A life fully under control is a life of solitude, from which the possibility of serendipity has been excluded. Serendipity is perhaps the secular name for grace. The push for rational control has been with us for some centuries, but has lately entered an especially frantic phase, and a jealous determination to leave no area of life untouched by this libido dominandi. Indeed, to trust in fate, or divine providence, or fortuna, is to be downright irresponsible. It's not safe, for one thing. There's a fearful timidity to the rationalist soul. I'm going to make much of that shortly. I think we can connect this timidity to ressentiment against the created order and its author. So Nietzsche is the one who sort of gave us that. He uses the French word for whatever reason, ressentiment. It means resentment, essentially. And it's the basic idea of it is captured in Aesop's fable of the fox and the grapes. Driven by hunger, a fox tried to reach some grapes hanging high on the vine, but was unable to, although he leaped with all his strength. As he walked away, the fox remarked, "Oh, you aren't even ripe yet. I don't need any sour grapes." To indulge in ressentiment is to deny that something is good, which is one way of responding to one's own impotence to achieve it. Instead of accepting one's limitations and preserving one's admiration for what cannot be achieved, One's vain smallness of soul leads one to tear down what is high, placing oneself above it. Notice that this is the opposite of becoming large by first becoming small, as in the connection I trace between grace and gratitude. Ressentiment instead turns the objective order of value upside down. One variation on this is the insistence that all values are merely subjective anyway. There's nothing truly higher that stands in judgment of my own character and capacities. This is to collapse the vertical dimension of reality in the hope of closing what I've taken to calling the erotic gap. Gratitude is important not merely because it makes us more psychologically healthy, but because I think it reflects a more adequate understanding of man's true situation. Those grapes are really there. They really are sweet. It is natural that we should strive for them, and natural that we should fall short. The man or woman of vitality takes pleasure in each thing being what it truly is. This is what it means to live in the erotic gap. Thus lived, our stinging awareness of our imperfection does not lead us to falsify the world. So I just mentioned the man or woman of vitality. I mean a person with a quality very different from the one I earlier called the timidity of the rationalist soul. And it turns out there's a whole tradition of thought called vitalism, which is fascinating. So historically, vitalism has been a philosophical idiom in which some kind of freedom is asserted, as against deterministic accounts of human being and reductive accounts of nature. Politically, it's marked by skepticism toward the material and institutional powers that assert their authority under the banner of progress. These long ago coalesced into a technoculture within which some basic questions about nature and human being have been not answered, but rather forgotten, kept at bay with harumphing, or declared obsolete by the progress of knowledge. This bears on the recurring political problem of the male. What place is there for his spiritedness, which is both hazardous and necessary to the community? This is an old question. It was a question for Plutarch, the subject of my dissertation, and it was a question for William James, among many others. In our technocratic managerial regime, this perennial problem of the male has become a crisis and is the guiding concern of a rebellious vitalism of the online right. And I'm somewhat sympathetic to this development. As a political form, technocracy leaves little room for the discharge of vital force, or indeed the exercise of basic competence and the development of practical reason by men and women who are in full possession of their world, and therefore have open to them a field of action. Sovereign, self-confident communities are colonized by expertise wielded remotely, and the epistemic status of common sense is demoted. According to the corresponding metaphysics, it's absurd to lament this diminution of man, as it rests simply on a recognition of reality. So, for example, the Stanford neuroscientist Robert Sapolsky recently announced that we have no free will. Our fond notions of individual agency and collective sovereignty belong to the adolescence of the race, and it's time to grow up. To be a mature person is to accept this. To be a vitalist is to reject this diminution. But on what basis? A competent vitalism would have to pass beyond rebellion and recover an alternative metaphysics of nature. So I want to relate two experiences. The first is one of feeling fully alive or vital. And the other is one of experiencing nature as something that summons us to a kind of erotic self-overcoming toward such possibilities. So, it's about 48 degrees Fahrenheit, and sweat is dripping down my back. My goggles are steamed up, and it's hard to see. I'm on a tract of land owned by the railroad, a wooded area in Richmond, Virginia, with discarded beer cans and the occasional homeless encampment, commonly referred to as behind the Martins. It was a supermarket. Riding a dirt bike on a narrow, meandering trail that is rocky and muddy, with protruding roots and fallen limbs, creek crossings, steep descents, and tight switchbacks. At a mere 15 miles per hour, I might be taxed to the very limit of my mental ability. Picking lines, making imperceptible decisions of throttle, clutch, steering, braking, and body English, revising them on the fly as surprises arrive at my front wheel. All of this demands total concentration. When I push the pace beyond my current level of confidence in response to some challenge of the terrain, it's a leap of faith. Or maybe it's a query, a question. I can't say to what entity this question is addressed. Myself, the obscurities of the trail, a loving providence. It's a position of utter exposure to contingency. Let's see how things go. If it goes well over the following seconds, meaning without mishap, maybe even with a glimmer of some new finesse, this faith redeemed is the sweetest vindication I know of. For a moment, I feel existentially justified. I feel less like a worm and more like that other thing, the thing I have a constant nagging sense that I ought to be. In pursuit of this feeling, I once took 4 trips to the emergency room over the course of 12 months. So it was 2 broken ribs, a broken heel, what I feared was a separated tendon, turned out to be a muscle strain, and a case of heat stroke. So this must have been about 10 years ago. So I was around, 47. So in other words, too old for this. The feeling of exposure one has on a dirt bike requires one to a basic truth. We are fragile, embodied beings. There's a certain risk that's inherent in moving around by whatever means. A responsible person does everything he can to minimize this risk. Yet is risk somehow bound up with humanizing possibilities? In his exquisite essay about walking the hostile streets of Kingston, Jamaica as a young boy, and then New Orleans as a young man, Garnett Cadogan writes, "When we first learn to walk, the world around us threatens to crash into us. Every step is risky. We train ourselves to walk without crashing by being attentive to our movements and extra attentive to the world around us. As an adult, we sometimes walk simply because the street beckons with serendipity. You never know who or what you're going to find when you step out onto an urban sidewalk." He goes on, "Serendipity," a mentor once told me, is a secular way of speaking of grace. It's unearned favor. Seen theologically, then, walking is an act of faith. Walking is, after all, interrupted falling. The heightened contingency of driving off-road resembles walking in the faith it enacts, that of throwing oneself into the world with hope. The ancient Greeks had a single word to express the condition of being without a road when the way forward is not clear. It's aporia. It represents a moment pregnant with the arrival of something unlooked for. These experiences of serendipity and faith feel a bit scarce in contemporary culture, and the language for articulating them seems to be fading from common use. We have a vision of the future in which there would be little scope for such moments. The most authoritative voices in commerce and technology express a determination to eliminate contingency from life as much as possible and replace it with machine-generated certainty. That's what automation does, whatever else it may accomplish. More broadly, a need for certainty is expressed in the project to expand rational control over domains that remain intolerably wild. At times, this project comes untethered from any utility-maximizing logic and looks more like a compulsion. It reveals a metaphysical orientation that seems a bit cramped or timid. The Dutch historian Johan Huizinga found the origins of civilization to lie in play. He wrote, "To dare, to take risks, to bear uncertainty, to endure tension, these are the essence of the play spirit." Let's put that thought beside another. Ratzinger points out that the Hebrew word amen has a rich variety of meanings. They include truth, firmness, firm ground. Also, loyalty, to trust, entrust oneself, take one's stand on something, believe in something. It's a very rich word. Ratzinger writes that the amen is a trustful placing of myself on the ground that upholds me, not because I have made it and checked it with my own calculations, but rather precisely because I have not made it and cannot check it. It expresses the abandonment of oneself to what we can neither make nor need to make, to the ground of the world as meaning. So, is there then something bold and life-affirming in faith, as there is in play? This trustful placing of myself on the ground that upholds me would seem to be a kind of existential courage. Maybe that's why people of easy and resolute religious faith seem lighthearted, as the courageous do. To trust in providence relieves one of anxiety for the future. To believe that the fundamental ontology of the world, being itself, is somehow trustworthy would seem to be something further in the same direction. It relieves one of anxiety for the present, and that's real abandon. A person in that state is in possession of a gift, and he shines. I suppose this is what charisma means. It's from the Greek word for grace. When I've pressed my luck on the trail, heedlessly as it were, this is on the dirt bike again, and that fleeting glimmer happens, it does feel like a shining state of grace. It is heedless of hazard, in a sense, but it's also heeding a call of some kind. Can it be accessed more reliably? This courage that makes one outrageously, luxuriously free? Ratzinger writes, what is belief, really? He says, to believe as a Christian means, in fact, entrusting oneself to the meaning that upholds me and the world, taking it as the firm ground on which I can stand fearlessly. It means affirming that the meaning we do not make but can only receive is already granted to us, so that we have only to take it and entrust ourselves to it. Christian faith lives on the discovery that not only is there such a thing as objective meaning, but that this meaning knows me and loves me. So the second experience I want to relate is one that I think points toward the possibility of grounding a Christian vitalism in something like a Christian animism. This is my final point. So everything I've said so far is just a big wind-up to talk about what I really want to talk about, which is dolphins. In particular, dolphins who surf. So the first time I saw this was mid-'80s. It was one of the fickle reef breaks between Santa Barbara and Ventura, sort of the central coast of California. And over the years, I've noticed that they seem to like it best at about 4 to 6 feet and glassy. On some days, there's a deep quiet that hangs over the water. No chop and no wind. It may be overcast, our coastal equivalent of a snowfall, muffling the static and churn. A squadron of brown pelicans can often be seen skimming silently a few inches off the water, which in Ventura County has a distinct autumnal color year-round. The horizon feels close. Out of the flat sea rises something curved and straight, growing distinct. It's a wave. When they are unmolested by the elements arriving from deep waters far away, they carry an eerie silence as they gather for a final violence. You can watch their approach, a rising hump of different colored water, a deepening shadow or opening brightness, depending on the light. A sensuous hump of unbroken water is surely the primeval pattern of breast and hip. As the wave encounters the jutting slope of the shore, it answers with a rise of its own, amplifying the moment. It becomes a vertical wall and remains poised. This is when they appear. Their firm, smooth flesh, visible just beneath the surface. Ocean shapes gliding fast inside the thick wall. I've seen them break the surface as the barrel folds over to better savor the hollowness. How do I know they savor it? It's plain to we who are kindred, all creatures here below who surf. The sporting of dolphins is something they are invited to by waves. Is nature hospitable then? The thing you can't help notice about waves is that each is an individual. There's no repetition, so they are inexhaustible in their beauty. Each expends itself entirely, returning to the entropic soup. Each presents us with the mortal frame compressed, that window of possibility within which beauty throws down her haughty challenge. Are you really living? Are you afraid of the cold waters that will surely punish your presumption, O land creature? This is not for you. The most exquisite beauties don't need to say it. They provoke by walking away, never to be seen again. The sting of it. Waves are hospitable, maybe, but they won't hold your hand as you gather your courage. In certain scenes, the hospitality of nature is like that of a mother. You've surely come across a sunny mountain meadow in noontime stillness. It feels like you've stepped into the illustration of a children's book. Where's the bunny? The air is 72 degrees Fahrenheit. Butterflies flit from flower to flower beside a babbling brook, and the ether feels like a soft caress. The fine-tuning of the whole scene to human felicity seems preposterous. One has to relax into the deep Sabbath on offer to regain one's naivete. This is not kitsch. It is simple benevolence. In other scenes, the hospitality of nature is more gamesome and edged. We're summoned to overcome our meadow selves by something alien that addresses us, berating our atrophy, a mountain that needs climbing at great hazard, or a thick and barreling wave that needs riding despite the certain beatings. For a certain kind of man, these things make their appearance before us like a beautiful woman that needs winning. If you can show your audacity equal to her petulance, first you must square up and present yourself as worthy to stand in her presence. This remains to be seen. There will be some slaps administered, you can be sure of it. This erotic dimension of our relation to nature, frustrating and humbling as often as exhilarating, is a deep fact I'd like to understand. It's a fact about human nature and a fact about nature simply. Together, they make up an erotic field with lines of force penetrating all that we are. My hunch is that a vitalism adequate to our present need will rest on some species of animism, that view of nature that we associate with primitive religion. A good friend of mine is a professor of dogmatic theology at a Catholic seminary, and he's been encouraging this, so I take some comfort in knowing that somehow there are elements in the tradition, Dionysius, Maximus the Confessor, a few others, to lend some creedal support for such a project. There's a vital force in man that is always precarious and must be kindled, as it's the source of his worth and the seat of his dignity. Naturalistic accounts of human being are thought to be demoting, as they subsume man to a realm of material causation and dumb necessity from which no free and resplendent deed can shine forth. This is certainly true of any reductive naturalism, in which nature herself is thought to be something inert, consistent, and certain. But to the greater part of mankind through recorded time, the idea of inanimate nature would have seemed a willful absurdity, a doctrine rightly embarrassed into silence by such mundane, observable facts as the individuality of waves, to say nothing of human beings. I've lately been coming around to the view that the cosmos is alive, and that it invites us to an effort of self-overcoming by which we become fully alive as well. Thank you.